When the police officers first entered the garage of the house on San Jose Street, they could not believe their eyes. Behind an ordinary door was hidden a narrow metal cage, lined with styrofoam and MDF boards. Inside, traces of the stay of Valentina Alvarez, 15 years old, were discovered. The family claims it was a bicycle accident, but the investigation results categorically contradict their version. Garage on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, 2nd of February 2025, early morning. Inside, criminalists work quietly and examine an unusual metal construction that resembles a cage. It is small, 1.6 by 2 meters, lined with thin styrofoam boards and MDF, obviously hastily assembled. In the lower part of the construction is a narrow slot about 12 centimeters long, whose edges are covered with dried blood traces. The experts pay attention to a fresh white paint layer on the garage door. Hidden welding seams suggest that someone obviously hurriedly wanted to eliminate traces. This cage is not just a strange structure. Exactly here, 15-year-old Valentina Alvarez was located for an extended period. Her mother, Rocio, and her stepfather, Diego, insist Valentina suffered fatal injuries from a fall from a bicycle. But already the first conclusions of the forensic experts strongly question this version. The examination establishes that Valentina weighed only 28 kilograms. She had severe sepsis. The organism was practically destroyed. Additionally, numerous scars were discovered on her limbs, traces of prolonged and systematic immobility. The parents' version finally collapses. The investigators begin searching the house and quickly find important evidence. In the documents, a receipt is discovered, issued by the hardware store Hierros La Matanza on the 6th of March, 2022. Exactly then, metal grills and angles were purchased that completely match the cage construction. This proves that the structure did not arise accidentally and was planned in advance. Furthermore, when examining Valentina's wound, the criminalists record a strange detail: rusty metal shavings. After analysis, it turns out that the metal found on Valentina differs in composition from what the cage was made of. This means only one thing. There is another unknown metal object that was in direct contact with Valentina but has not yet been found by the investigation. Suspicion immediately falls on Valentina's stepfather, Diego Medina. He's a powerfully built man, works as a security guard, is accustomed to controlling the situation. His behavior immediately raises serious doubts among the police officers. Medina speaks confidently, but his words about the family's life and Valentina's living conditions seem rehearsed and unnatural. Rocio, Valentina's mother, also raises questions. The woman works nowhere, is withdrawn, tries to avoid contact with neighbors. When investigators begin asking questions about her daughter, Rocio becomes nervous and obviously tries to hide the true details of what happened in the house. They place exactly the stepfather and Valentina's mother under special observation to understand which of them is more involved. When checking neighborhood statements, one fact emerges. A few days before Valentina's discovery, a neighbor noticed how Diego was actively painting something on the garage doors late at night, as if he was hurrying to eliminate traces. Initially, the investigation pursues a version connected to Valentina's biological father, Miguel Alvarez. He had long since divorced Rocio and lives 600 kilometers from Buenos Aires, in the city of Córdoba. In his direction, investigators begin a check, assuming that he might have been involved in the events. But after a short time, this version completely falls away. Video surveillance recordings and the absence of tickets or other evidence of his travels confirm that Miguel did not leave Córdoba. On the metal construction in the garage, there are no traces of his DNA. The investigators officially recognize that the biological father has no relation to this case. But the main mystery remains the metal shavings found in Valentina's wound. The metal composition does not correspond to the cage. This means there is another unknown metal object that is hidden somewhere nearby. The investigation is already certain that finding this object will help reveal the true role of Valentina's stepfather, Diego Medina. As long as this object is not found, the investigators keep this detail secret and try to stay ahead of those who are already trying to eliminate evidence. 4 days have passed since the beginning of the investigation. The main object of the investigation's attention remains Diego Medina, Valentina's stepfather. Now that it has become known that the metal construction was not randomly assembled, investigators begin studying all his steps and financial operations. A strange fact comes into the police's field of view. Diego Medina bought the materials for the cage in March 2022, but he did this secretly, avoiding bank transfers through his employer. Why did he deliberately act secretly and try to cover the traces of the financial operation? A check of his bank accounts begins. The investigators receive an official paper printout from the Banco Nación branch from the 6th of March 2022. The printout confirms the cash payment for the metal at the Hierros La Matanza store. Exactly on this day, according to information from the trading establishment, Medina bought metal grills and angles, materials from which later exactly this cage was made. The cash payment was an obvious attempt to avoid any electronic trace that could later be discovered by the employer or police. The investigators go further. They conduct conversations with neighbors who might have noticed something in recent years. One of the neighbors, Alejandro Perez, who lives directly across from the Alvarez family house, reports an important detail. He claims that on the evening of the 11th of April 2022, the characteristic sound of a welding device could be heard in the garage. This was about a month after purchasing the materials. Alejandro paid attention to the garage because he saw bright sparks that penetrated through the ventilation grate. The neighbor's statements give the investigation another important piece of evidence. Diego did not assemble the construction immediately after purchasing the materials, but after several weeks. This means that the cage's appearance was a planned action. However, the most interesting thing is that the neighbor claims there were at least 2 people in the garage. Through the grate, he clearly saw the silhouettes of 2. This immediately raises the question of whether Medina could have manufactured the metal construction independently or whether he had an accomplice. The police officers conduct measurements again and examine the construction in detail to understand whether Diego could have managed the work independently. The specialists' conclusions are unambiguous. For quality welding of the metal construction, the help of a second person was necessary, who would have held the parts and controlled the process. Thus, the version of Medina's sole involvement completely loses its foundation. The investigation turns to the neighbor again to clarify details. Alejandro calmly confirms his words and adds an important detail. He saw 2 silhouettes. One obviously belonged to Medina, tall and powerful, and the second was smaller and more delicate. The neighbor could not recognize faces, as both people wore welding protective masks. But in his opinion, the second silhouette could quite well have belonged to a woman of medium height. This information opens a new branch of the investigation. If the second person who helped Diego was really a woman, this means that in the garage there was not accidental help, but someone from Medina's close circle. The police officers are not yet hurrying with conclusions. They name no names and do not reveal who the second welder might have been. But exactly a woman of medium height becomes the new unknown element in the case. Meanwhile, the press actively spreads the image of Medina as the sole culprit. The media have already begun creating the portrait of a lone perpetrator monster, attributing to him full responsibility for what happened to Valentina. However, the investigators understand that this path leads to a dead end. Fixation on Diego's figure as the sole organizer is a false trail that can lead to ignoring other important participants. The police consciously keep away from such an interpretation of events and continue systematically studying every detail of the case. Neighbor Alejandro adds another detail that causes the investigation to intensify attention on Medina's environment. He is certain that the woman who was next to Diego in the garage was not just a random helper. According to his words, both persons worked like a well-coordinated team, silently and quickly, as if they had long been accustomed to hiding something together. With this statement, the neighbor causes the investigation to delve deeper into the role of Valentina's mother, Rocio Alvarez. She now becomes the figure that investigators must check particularly carefully. The investigation faces a new task: to prove or refute Rocio's participation in creating the cage. Without this, it's impossible to fully understand the role of each of the adults who had been around Valentina in recent years. Thus, the picture of Diego Medina gains additional depth and complexity. He no longer looks like a lone organizer of the crime. Medina acted secretly, trying to avoid traces and obvious mistakes. But now, it becomes clear that someone else was beside him, whose role the investigation must clarify very soon. 2 days pass. The investigation gradually moves into a new phase. Now the investigation studies Valentina's environment and tries to find out how it could happen that over several years, no one noticed her absence. An important link here becomes the school where Valentina was officially registered. The first question facing the investigation is how the educational institution could not notice the long absence of their student. After all, Valentina was formally registered among the students, and her disappearance should have been obvious at least to the teachers and the principal. The investigators come to the school and begin checking documents. In the municipal archive, paper reports are found according to which Valentina was supposedly taught at home. All reports are signed by her mother, Rocio Alvarez, who had previously worked in this school as a secretary. The documents look completely ordinary at first glance and arouse no suspicions. However, the criminalists notice peculiarities in the stamps with which the papers are certified. They decide to check their authenticity by sending the materials for special expertise of the printing ink. The expertise confirms the investigators' suspicions. The stamps were made in a handcrafted manner, and the ink does not correspond to the original school stamp. Thus, it is confirmed that the reports about Valentina's homeschooling are forgeries. Now it becomes clear why the school officially did not notice Valentina's disappearance. Rocio Alvarez used her previous work experience at the school to avoid any suspicions. She knew how to issue documents so that no one would pay attention to inconsistencies. The investigators now have the next important task: to find out who helped Rocio certify these papers and whether she could act alone. The investigation conducts questioning of teachers and administrative staff of the school. The question that interests the police is obvious. Who could have certified or signed blank reports? The answer comes quickly. It turns out that Rocio had full access to report forms even before her dismissal and could easily take them. She was a trusted employee of the administration, therefore no one controlled her actions. The school maintained paper records, and forms were kept strictly under the control of the secretary and principal. But since Rocio was part of this process, her possibilities for manipulation were practically unlimited. At the time of her dismissal, no one thought to compare the number of remaining blank reports. Rocio took advantage of this. Nevertheless, the police initially develop a version that Rocio did not act alone, but in agreement with someone from the school administration. The main figure of suspicions becomes the principal. She could have had a benefit or been involved in document forgery. Checking the financial declarations and bank operations of the school principal is conducted quickly and thoroughly. The investigators find nothing suspicious. Not a single additional deposit to her accounts in recent years is discovered. The version of agreement with school administration is officially removed from the agenda. The police conclude that Rocio acted completely independently and did not inform any of the school employees about her plans. This decision allows the investigation to redirect attention back to Rocio and her immediate environment. However, during detailed examination of school premises, criminalists find an unexpected trace. In the school basement, a box with blank report forms is discovered that should not be there. The investigators conduct a recount and notice a correspondence between the shortage of blank reports and the number of forged documents found in the archive. This means that Rocio took exactly as many reports as she then used for forging Valentina's school reports. Now it becomes clear that her actions were clearly planned and implemented without involving third parties from among school employees. The investigators carefully confiscate the box with blank reports as evidence. These very documents make it possible to finally confirm Rocio Alvarez's organizational abilities and her determination to keep Valentina outside the view of her surroundings. Now the police know for certain that Rocio consciously misled the school and administration. Thus, the puzzle of why the school did not notice Valentina's disappearance is partially solved. But much still lies ahead for the investigators. After all, the documents themselves are only part of the overall picture. The main goal of the investigation is to understand how Rocio's and Diego's actions were connected to each other and what really happened in the Alvarez family house behind the closed garage doors. The investigation moves forward. Now the attention of criminalists is again concentrated on the garage of the Alvarez family house. Let us remember that one detail remained unclear: the origin of metal shavings found at Valentina's wounds. They did not match in composition with the metal of the cage's basic construction. Now investigators understand that the solution to this detail lies much closer than it seemed before. Where did the metal shavings found on Valentina come from if their composition differs from the material of the cage itself? The answer becomes clear only after a thorough repeated examination of the garage. Under a metal stand in the back corner, investigators notice something strange. Two short pieces of a metal rod that were previously hidden and unnoticed. On the rods, a marking is clearly visible: Hierros La Matanza 1124. These rods obviously do not belong to the original construction and were bought much later, in November 2024. Experts conduct an urgent check of the metal composition of these rods with samples previously found at Valentina's wounds. The match is absolute. These very pieces became the source of metal shavings. Now it becomes clear to investigators that in November last year, someone conducted work in the garage connected to modifying the cage. The investigation goes to the hardware store, Hierros La Matanza. There, the store cashier confidently recognizes Rocio Alvarez in the photo. According to his words, she bought several grinding discs on the 20th of November 2024. This detail, seemingly insignificant, actually strongly influences the course of the investigation. It proves that Rocio was engaged in active work in the garage shortly before the last events. Now investigators have an obvious connection between the purchase of metal rods and subsequent work on processing them. Rocio obviously reinforced the cage and made its construction stronger and more robust. But why did Rocio need to do this 2 years after installing the cage? The answer to this question comes from Valentina herself. In her diary, which was already confiscated in early February, a small but extremely important entry is discovered. Rod broken 23, 11/24. Now it becomes clear that the cage construction was already damaged and required urgent repair. Apparently, Valentina managed to break or bend one of the cage elements, which forced Rocio to quickly conduct repair work. A suspicion arises that is quickly picked up by some journalists and experts commenting on the case. Perhaps Rocio actually tried to free Valentina by weakening the cage construction. Such an interpretation of events could have changed the entire course of the investigation and the investigation's position regarding Valentina's mother. However, after careful analysis of the facts, the investigators officially reject this version. The damage was obviously unintentional. Valentina's diary testifies that the construction was damaged by herself accidentally or in a moment of desperation. And Rocio, on the contrary, urgently tried to eliminate the disturbances and strengthen the construction. Thus, the version that the mother tried to help Valentina is officially recognized as false. While the police conduct further examination of the area, an investigator discovers another important find. In the garbage bin across from the Alvarez family house, a suspicious package is found. In the package are remains of a diary, partially burned pages and pieces of bandages soaked with dried blood. At first glance, this find seems confusing and even sinister. The investigators carefully take the diary and bandages, preserving them as important pieces of evidence. The burned diary and bandages immediately present the investigation with a new puzzle. The entries in the diary are practically destroyed by fire. Deciphering the content is impossible for now. An urgent forensic expertise for text restoration is scheduled. although hopes for success are low. As for the bandages, the investigators don't rush to conclusions. There isn't enough information about the origin and role of these bandages to formulate hypotheses. Around the garage and the Alvarez family itself, there are still many secrets and unspoken things. With each new find, the police dive deeper into the details of what happened here in recent months. Now, only one thing is obvious. Rocio Alvarez was not just a passive witness. She acted actively and carefully maintained the secret hidden in the garage. But what exactly lay behind her actions? The investigation has yet to determine. The investigators continue to carefully study the personal papers found in the Alvarez family house. Every document is now considered a key to understanding what happened behind the closed garage doors. An important question remains. Who exactly suggested isolating Valentina in the cage? Diego Medina or Rocio Alvarez? The answer to this question begins to be sought in Rocio's correspondence and personal records. Among the items confiscated during the search, a letter is found that Rocio sent to her sister in Spain in 2019. In the letter is a brief but clear phrase. Valempega, no sé qué hacer. Valentina hits. I don't know what to do. This is the very first testimony that problems within the family had existed for a long time. But the investigation is still unclear whether this phrase could have become the starting point for further actions toward isolation. The next document brings additional clarity. Among the family papers, a draft of the family budget for 2022 is found. The investigators study this sheet of paper carefully and notice an unusual entry made by Rocio's hand. Pension, guardianship, expensive. Now it becomes clear that Rocio considered the possibility of official guardianship over Valentina by a specialized institution, but the financial aspect became an obstacle. The documents testify that she initially wanted to choose a different path to solve the problem, but ultimately abandoned this idea for precisely economic reasons. Meanwhile, the investigation continues searching for documents that could more precisely establish the authorship of the idea to create the cage. And such a document is quickly found. This is another letter that Rocio sent to her sister in Spain at the beginning of 2022, just before purchasing materials for the cage. In the letter, there is a brief and sinister sentence. Diego dice jaula o policía. Diego says cage or police. This entry becomes the turning point. Now the investigators clearly understand. The initiative came directly from Diego Medina. Rocio found herself faced with a choice, and her choice became the beginning of the terrible events whose consequences are now being investigated. However, the investigation poses another important question. Why did Rocio's sister, after receiving the disturbing letters, not react in any way and not contact law enforcement? The police quickly check Rocio's sister's passport data. Official exit and entry stamps testify that she hasn't been in Argentina since 2019. Consequently, she couldn't personally verify the situation or take any actions on the spot. This fact makes it possible to close the version about possible help or complicity on the sister's part. She was really informed about the problems, but was physically too far away to intervene. The investigation is forced to remove suspicion from Rocio's sister, although the press had already begun spreading the version that the relative could have informed authorities and prevented what happened. But this version is not confirmed and is officially recognized as false. The investigation again focuses exclusively on the family circle, consisting of Rocio and Diego Medina. In the course of additional examination of the garage, the investigators make another important discovery. Under a pile of old things, an industrial fan is found. It is powerful, an old model, and on its housing the volume is indicated. 70 decibels. The fan is connected to a timer on which a work time interval from 22 hours to 6 in the morning is set. The experts quickly understand that its function was to create constant loud noise during nighttime, when it was easiest for neighbors to hear all sounds coming from the garage. This way, Diego and Rocio could additionally protect themselves from accidental attention from the surroundings. The investigators record this find as further evidence of careful planning and intentional concealment of what was happening in the garage. Now it becomes clear how far Rocio and Diego could go to hide reality and keep Valentina in isolation. The connected fan confirms the investigation's version that Valentina was deprived of any possibility to raise her voice and attract attention. Thus, the investigation currently establishes with certainty that Diego Medina was precisely the initiator of the isolation idea, and Rocio supported it by choosing this path instead of seeking official help. The found letters and documents confirm the consciousness of both adults' actions and their joint responsibility for what happened. All this only strengthens the importance of further examination of Valentina's diary and those mysterious bandages that were recently found. The investigation is certain that answers to the last remaining questions are hidden in these details. The investigation approaches the final phase. Laboratory workers finish analyzing the contents of the bag found in the garbage bin across from the Alvarez family house. This bag, partially burned, has already become an important link in the chain of evidence. Experts carefully extract everything that remained after the fire. An important question that investigators seek an answer to is what exactly the suspects concealed when they disposed of this bag's contents. The analyses begin to yield results. First comes information about the bandages. Forensic chemistry establishes that they were soaked not only with blood, but also with purulent discharge. Comparison of blood types gives a clear match. It belongs to Valentina. This discovery becomes a turning point. Now it's clear to the investigation that Valentina was not only in confinement and isolation, but suffered serious injuries that remained without medical help for an extended period. The next piece of evidence that criminalists found helps reconstruct the picture of events even more detailed. In the garage, in the cage, investigators again carefully examine every detail and pay attention to the mattress. On it, a small cut of about 4 centimeters in length can be noticed. Comparison of this cut with the previously found cage bars confirms. This damage corresponds exactly to the bar that Valentina damaged in November 2024. Now the investigation finally connects the cage damage with the injury that Valentina received at that time. The experts don't doubt. It was precisely through this sharp metal edge that the deep injury occurred, whose traces remained on the bandages from the bag. Another fundamental question arises. Can the blood on the bandages be precisely dated? Modern forensic technologies make it possible to determine with high accuracy the age of bloodstains through the degree of hemoglobin degradation. The experts quickly conduct tests and confirm that the blood on the bandages originated around November 2024, with a permissible deviation of about 10 days. This date completely coincides with the period of cage damage described in Valentina's diary. Against the background of these facts, a version appears again that is put forward by some journalists and even some investigators, that allegedly Valentina might have voluntarily isolated herself out of shame or fear. But this version is also quickly refuted by the evidence found. The recording obtained in Valentina's diary leaves no doubt. "Mama has locked me up. I feel sick." This simple phrase excludes voluntary isolation and only confirms that Valentina became a hostage to her own mother's actions. Now the investigation can officially recognize this false trail as closed and completely excluded from the investigation. However, the garage prepares yet another unexpected and disturbing surprise for the investigation. In the depths of the room, under the shelf, investigators find a plastic container with food remnants. Rice and bread are completely covered with mold. Inside lies a receipt from the grocery store Almacén Ruta, dated the 1st of February 2025. The products were obviously bought one day before the last tragic events. The criminalists carefully take the container as additional evidence, without hurrying to draw conclusions. This find remains in reserve, but becomes an important element of future investigative actions. They already sense that precisely in this detail the answer might be hidden to how Rocio and Diego planned to justify their actions before the police. Another 4 days pass, and the investigation shifts to the night when medics were called. The investigators request the archive of emergency service 107 telephone calls. The audio recording of the call is completely preserved and becomes important evidence. What exactly happened on the night of the 2nd of February 2025? And why didn't the parents call for help earlier? When examining the recording, investigators clearly hear Rocio's voice telling the dispatcher about an accident. But in the background, Diego's quiet, almost incomprehensible voice can be heard, whispering a clear instruction to her. "Di que se cayó?" This phrase becomes the most important testimony that the parents intentionally lied from the beginning and were aware of the consequences of their actions. From the dispatcher's journal, an additional important detail emerges. The call was made not from a mobile phone, but from the home landline. This confirms that both Rocio and Diego were at home at the time of the call for help, which completely refutes any version that one of them was at another location. Forensic experts conduct one more important verification. The assessment of the temperature of Valentina's remains shows that at the time of the ambulance's arrival, she had already been dead for at least 40 minutes. This means that the call was consciously made after death and not in an attempt to prevent it. Medina's lawyer tries to convince the investigation that his client was not at home that night and was at work. But the journal of the checkpoint of the private security company where Diego worked shows the opposite. Precisely on this day, Medina officially took time off and didn't go to his shift. This lie is officially closed. In Diego's bedroom, in the wastebasket, police find a draft resignation letter dated the 1st of February 2025. Now it becomes clear that Diego planned in advance to disappear, as he understood the inevitability of discovery. All evidence leads to an inevitable finale. The investigation prepares to present the complete picture of the crime, the motive, and the circumstances of what happened behind the doors of the Alvarez family house. The investigation approaches its logical conclusion. It is already known who was behind the decision to isolate Valentina, who hid reality, and who consistently destroyed evidence. Now the investigation faces the last and most important question. Was there a chance to save Valentina if the parents had asked for help in time? Investigators begin examining Valentina's medical records from recent years. They pay special attention to the period of 2024. Precisely then, the serious injury occurred whose consequences led to tragedy. In the outpatient medical file for the entire year 2024, not a single record of doctor visits is found. The parents never once sought medical help. This becomes the first disturbing discovery that directly points to negligence and conscious neglect of Valentina's health. Moreover, the toxicologist expert establishes during additional analysis no traces of antibiotics or other medications that could have stopped the spread of infection were found in Valentina's organism. This means only one thing. The injury that led to severe infection was completely ignored by the parents. Doctors could have easily dealt with such an infection if help had been provided in time. However, the parents decided otherwise. In Valentina's diary, investigators find another record that confirms that both Valentina herself and the parents were fully informed about the severity of her condition. On one of the diary pages, Valentina herself made a pencil drawing of her wound and labeled it briefly and disturbingly, "Huele feo," smells bad. This small detail becomes key evidence that Valentina was desperate and completely understood the severity of the situation she was in. But the parents took no measures and ignored the reality in which she found herself. Investigators pose the next logical question. Did the parents really not understand how serious everything was? The answer is found quickly and clearly. The diary expertise, witness testimonies, and medical expertise clearly confirm that both Diego and Rocio were fully informed about Valentina's condition. They saw the deterioration of her condition, knew about the injury and the smell that clearly indicated infection, but consciously decided not to call doctors. Their behavior speaks of complete control of the situation, in which they consciously denied their daughter medical help. Rocio's defender tries to present a different version of events and explains that allegedly Rocio wanted to call a doctor, but Diego Medina forbade her. But this version is also quickly refuted. Investigators question neighbors repeatedly. One of the neighbors, who lives near the Alvarez family house, reports important details. He clearly heard conversations of both parents in the garage where they argued, and Rocio's voice also said the phrase, "Don't call." Thus the defense fails, which tries to transfer all responsibility to Diego Medina. This version is officially closed, as witness testimonies clearly point to Rocio's complicity in concealing what happened. In the final phase of the investigation, forensic psychologists work with both suspects. Rocio Alvarez's behavior during interrogations attracts special attention. The psychologist records a disturbing detail. Every time the conversation turns to Valentina's prolonged isolation and especially to the silence in the house, a barely noticeable but distinct smile appears on Rocio's face. This causes confusion and concern among specialists. Rocio's behavior becomes another element indicating that Valentina's isolation was not only a decision in desperation, but probably corresponded to certain inner desires of Rocio herself. The psychological conclusions of the court expert are now officially attached to the case and become one of the important points of accusation. The behavior of both parents recorded by the investigation points to intentional and systematic actions that made the tragedy inevitable. The parents had many opportunities to prevent the development of events, but never used them once, instead actively hiding the situation from outside eyes. At the present time, the investigation has all necessary evidence to present the complete picture in court. Diego Medina and Rocio Alvarez are officially recognized as responsible for what happened, and now they must answer for their actions in court. The question of why adult people made exactly such decisions will become central in the court proceedings that will begin very soon. The courtroom is completely filled. All eyes are directed at the judges who are preparing to announce the verdict. After 7 long months of meticulous work, interrogations, expert examinations, and countless hours of studying documents and evidence, the investigation is complete. Today, the final verdict will be pronounced in one of the most sensational cases of recent times, the case of the Alvarez family. The judge calmly and clearly counts the facts. It was established that the idea of isolating Valentina in the metal construction was not spontaneous and not unilateral. It arose as a result of discussions, and its realization became a joint decision of Rocio Alvarez and Diego Medina. Evidence of this includes letters, financial records, and witness testimonies. The critical moment of the case was November 2024. Valentina breaks a metal bar of the cage in an attempt to get out and receives a deep thigh injury. Rocio immediately reacts to the damage to the construction. On the 20th of November 2024, she buys grinding discs and additionally reinforces the metal bars without caring about treating her own daughter. The examination of blood on the bandages and mattress confirmed that the wound was severe, and its ignoring by the parents led to the fatal outcome. Diego Medina forbade calling doctors, fearing that this would attract police attention and cost him his job and personal reputation. The parents knew about the severity of Valentina's condition, but consciously decided not to intervene and tried independently to hide the problem. Finally, on the night of the 2nd of February 2025, what they so feared happened. Valentina died. The parents did not try to save her even in the final minutes. On the contrary, they decided to wait, hide traces, and only about 40 minutes after death make a call to emergency services, pretending that an accident had occurred. During the court proceedings, all necessary evidence was presented. Receipts for building materials and discs, witness testimonies about welding work and nighttime activities, results of blood and bandage analysis, Valentina's diary and the fan, working at night to mask noise. The chain of facts built up clearly and uninterruptedly without any doubt about their credibility. Also presented was the draft of Diego Medina's resignation letter, found in the house's wastebasket, dated the 1st of February 2025. This confirmed that Medina had a plan to leave Buenos Aires and move to Córdoba, trying to hide in this way and start a new life. The moment of verdict announcement comes. The judge announces with a firm voice the court decision. Rocio Alvarez is sentenced to 27 years of imprisonment, Diego Medina to 24 years. Upon hearing the verdict, Rocio unexpectedly stands up and shouts emotionally, "Injusticia!" Medina remains silent, lowers his head and does not raise his gaze. Heavy silence in the courtroom. The verdict is finally announced. The elevator doors of the courthouse close slowly, leaving behind the noise and shouts of reporters. In the silence of the office, the investigator carefully folds the case papers and makes the final notation. Intent to murder, not clearly proven. And in this remains the last, thin thread of uncertainty that the investigation could not completely resolve. He was found in a condition that disturbed even experienced medical professionals. In size, he corresponded to a 10-year-old child, but in weight, he barely reached that of a 3-year-old child. Living skeleton. This is what those who first saw Joshua on that early February morning quietly called him. At that time, no one yet understood that behind this shocking image was hidden not a disease, but something much darker and stranger. In the early morning of the 13th of February 2024, the small town of Ripley in the state of Ohio was disturbed by a call to the emergency number 911. It was 53 minutes after 5 o'clock. A woman named Danielle H. reported that her son Joshua had suffered from high fever all night, and in the morning showed no signs of life. Fear, confusion, and panic sounded in her voice. She claimed that ordinary flu was to blame. But when rescue workers arrived at the scene, they quickly realized that this was not just about an illness. The main secret of this story was located under the roof of the house, in an old attic, to which Danielle herself led the medics and police. The room proved to be small and strangely prepared. A layer of dense polyurethane foam covered the walls and windows, blocking almost all daylight and isolating from noise. The nearest neighbor lived almost 150 meters away, and behind the house ran the Federal Highway US 33. The constant rumbling of trucks reached 55 decibels at night and completely drowned out all sounds that could have come from the house. This strange environment immediately made the specialists who arrived attentive. Joshua was found on an old metal cot that stood in the middle of the attic. The first thing that immediately caught the investigators' attention was a bicycle chain of the kryptonite brand that was chained to the bed leg. It looked new, robust, and was obviously not accidental. Why this chain was here in the attic of an ordinary family house, the police did not yet understand at this moment. The medics described Joshua's condition with maximum restraint and sobriety, but even then terrifying details were obvious. His weight was only 17 kilograms. This meant that the body mass index was catastrophically low, only about 9.5, which is practically incompatible with life. Around the boy's waist, a strange, continuous scar could be seen, whose origin also remained incomprehensible at this moment. The mother's original version about the flu now only raised more questions. Downstairs in the house, while the police were examining Joshua's discovery site, the parents were in the kitchen. Danielle sat at the table crying continuously and could barely put together a few words. Her husband, 42-year-old Mark H., seemed different. He was completely calm, kept distance from his wife and remained silent. His hands were covered with machine oil as if he had just repaired something in the garage. He answered police questions very briefly and avoided any details, which also drew the investigators' attention. The police's first logical version was connected with the mother, Danielle. She was the one who had last seen Joshua alive. She was the one who claimed it had been ordinary flu. Her words contradicted the picture that the medics observed. The police noted the woman's strange behavior, her unnaturally emotional reactions, but drew no conclusions yet. The father also came under scrutiny, Mark H., a strict, taciturn man about whom neighbors spoke briefly and cautiously. Disciplined. This is how the few who knew him somehow spoke about him. His calmness in such a situation seemed suspicious. But in the first hours after the police arrived, another family member particularly attracted attention. Evan M., Joshua's stepbrother, who had recently turned 24 years old. Evan lived in the basement of the same house. During the first questioning, he explained that he had heard Joshua's footsteps at 5 o'clock in the morning. This information seemed strange, because according to the mother's words, the boy was already feeling very bad at that time and was not getting up from bed. Evan behaved noticeably nervously, avoided looking the investigators in the eyes, and seemed overall more worried than the others. Initially, the police suspected that a conflict between Evan and Joshua might have led to the tragedy. This version was considered first. But just after a few hours, the medical report from the coroner's office completely turned the course of the investigation upside down. According to the forensic doctor's report, no signs of viral illness were found in Joshua. The cause of the tragedy was extreme emaciation and multiple organ failure. In other words, Joshua simply slowly died from lack of food and care. Officially, the flu version ceased to exist. This conclusion called into question the words of all family members. But one important question remained. What was that bicycle chain that was chained to the bed needed for? There were no answers to this question in the first hours of the investigation yet. The whole picture seemed incomplete, and the version connected with Evan now seemed increasingly less convincing. The investigators understood that this story was just beginning to unfold. For now, only the facts mattered. The isolated attic, the metal cot connected with the chain, and Joshua's critical condition for which illness was only a false explanation. Evan M. came under the focus of investigations only temporarily. His version was not convincing, but was not yet formally completely dismissed. But already by the end of the day, investigators began to suspect that Evan was a false trail leading away from the main cause of the tragedy. Why did Mark H., the father who personally bought the chain found in the attic, maintain absolute calm in all interrogations and constantly referred only to his work? 5 days after Joshua was found in the attic, the investigation had already completely shifted toward the family father, Mark. The investigations carefully examined his actions in recent months, and concrete evidence came to the forefront that seemed almost irrefutable. During the search of the garage in the H. couple's house, police discovered a receipt from the Lowe's hardware store. Purchase date: 2nd of July 2023. In the list of purchased goods, a kryptonite bicycle chain and a reliable lock with a total value of $38 were clearly listed. Mark himself had made the purchase. Thus it turned out that the person who assured he had nothing to do with the events in the attic was directly connected to the key evidence. When experts examined the lock on the chain, their suspicions only intensified. Mixed DNA was discovered on the chain, from Mark himself and from Joshua. Now the investigation seemed to have convincing grounds to suspect Mark. However, his behavior did not correspond at all to the situation that had arisen. In every interrogation, Mark remained calm and was even slightly irritated that the investigators, in his words, were distracting him from work. Mark is 42 years old. He is an employee of the local chemical factory where he has worked for more than 12 years. In the factory, working time is strictly recorded by the electronic chronos system. This very system registered that Mark came to the factory on the 12th of February at 1955 and left the company premises the next morning at 6:04. This data practically excluded his participation in the events in the attic that night. But the police were in no hurry to draw conclusions. The investigators carefully checked the data log of the chronos system and noticed an important period that was insufficiently clarified. From the moment Mark left the house on the evening of the 12th of February until his appearance at the workplace, about 70 minutes of free time remained. This was completely sufficient to reach the factory, which was only 12 kilometers from the house, and even to undertake additional actions. These very 70 minutes transformed Mark's absolutely reliable alibi into something indefinite and shaky. The police checked the route practically. It turned out that the journey from the house to the chemical factory takes no more than 15 minutes by car, even considering evening traffic. If Mark had planned his actions in advance, he could quite possibly have used part of this time to be in the attic and attach the chain to the cot. Mark himself categorically rejected any assumptions about his involvement. He referred to the stability of his life and demanded an explanation of why he would suddenly have done something like this. Each time he returned to his work and referred to the Kronos system records as the only possible proof of his non-involvement. The investigation posed the question, could Mark really accomplish everything in those 70 minutes? The expert's answer was clear. Yes, he could. The time spent on the journey and attaching the chain fit perfectly into this period. Mark had no hurry on the evening of the 12th of February and no outside witnesses who could confirm or refute his words. While the police methodically checked Mark's statements, another participant disappeared from the investigation. Evan M., Joshua's stepbrother, who had initially come under investigation scrutiny, was now completely excluded from the circle of suspects. According to the same data from the Kronos system, Evan worked a shift from 19 hours 3 to 4:55 on the day of the tragedy. The time of his presence in the factory was also confirmed by video recordings from work cameras. Now, his version that he had heard Joshua's footsteps around 5 in the morning no longer seemed strange. Evan was vindicated and definitively freed from suspicions. His line proved to be false and was completely closed by the investigation. Repeatedly, the investigators returned to the kryptonite chain. Why did the person who had made such a purchase many months before the incident feel no concern? Why did Mark remain so self-confident, despite the obvious evidence of his involvement in what happened on the attic? Exactly at this moment, the investigation received an unexpected expert examination result. Another DNA sample was found on the bicycle chain lock. The epithelial cells belonged to Danielle H., Joshua's mother. This detail changed the entire situation and questioned the clarity of the picture that had seemed so obvious just a few hours earlier. Now the investigation faced a new question: how deeply Danielle was involved in this story and how her DNA had gotten on the chain, about which she had previously mentioned nothing. The police thought for the first time that Mark's calmness might be explained by the fact that he was not the only one who knew what exactly the chain was intended for. Perhaps he was not the main figure of this tragedy. Why did the school social worker who visited the H family house in August not return with a follow-up check, despite Joshua's isolation from the outside world? When the police officers returned to the events that preceded February 2024, they noticed an unusual detail. On the 15th of August 2023, a school social worker visited the H couple's house for the first time in a long while. The purpose of the visit was standard: to assess home conditions and ensure Joshua's safety. At this moment, the social worker registered no alarming signals. According to the official report signed that same day, everything was in order at the H family house. The social worker noted that Mark and Danielle behaved friendly, living conditions met the norm, the family appeared cooperative. It seemed there was no reason for further checks. But already at the beginning of the school year, on the 1st of October 2023, Joshua stopped attending classes at Ripley Middle School. His classmates and teachers received no understandable explanation. In Joshua's school file, which was later made available to the investigation, a strange paper with a medical certificate was found. It stated that Joshua had allegedly been sent for treatment to his aunt in Ohio and temporarily could not attend school. The certificate was properly written, had an official appearance, and even contained the signature of the school nurse, Kathy R. Why didn't social services initiate a new check when Joshua disappeared from their site for a long time? The answer soon became obvious. The investigators retrieved the archives of telephone records from the school social service. On the 10th of October 2023, the social worker called the H family's home number to clarify the situation with Joshua's long absence. Mark himself answered the phone. His voice sounded calm, self-confident. Mark explained to the employee that Joshua was indeed in Ohio, receiving treatment, and would soon return to school. The telephone recording of this conversation was preserved and confirmed Mark's words. The social worker saw no reason to doubt and sent no follow-up check. However, investigators noticed a discrepancy in the official documents. The certificate from the school file, allegedly signed by Kathy R., looked suspicious. An urgent graphological examination was ordered, and the results were unexpected. The examination showed that the signature on the certificate completely matched the handwriting sample of Danielle H., Joshua's mother. This meant that Danielle had forged the medical certificate to justify Joshua's absence from school. Now it became clear that the family intentionally isolated Joshua from the outside world. The invented story about treatment at his aunt's allowed the H couple to completely hide Joshua from teachers, classmates, and social services for several months. Danielle was the initiator of the document forgery. However, the question remained open. Was she the only participant in this plan? The school nurse, Kathy R., whose name appeared in the forged certificate, automatically came under suspicion. The investigation considered it necessary to check her possible involvement in the events. However, it became clear quite quickly that Kathy was on legal leave on the 1st of October when the forged paper was issued, which was confirmed not only by official school documents but also by testimony from her colleagues. On the day of the certificate's issuance, Nurse Kathy was outside the city. Her physical presence at school was impossible. Thus, the version of Kathy R.'s involvement in forging the medical certificate was completely excluded. The nurse had nothing to do with her name being unlawfully used in official papers. The investigation closed this false lead and directed attention back to Joshua's mother. Meanwhile, one problem remained unsolved. Why didn't the school social worker insist on a personal meeting with Joshua even after the formal call on the 10th of October? Didn't personally verify his health? The absence of a follow-up check was explained not only by Mark's call but also by that originally perfect picture that the family had demonstrated in August. At that time, nothing aroused the social worker's suspicions, and Mark's assurances in the telephone conversation sounded absolutely convincing. The social worker considered the situation normal and took no further action. From the H family's side, everything looked as if they were simply trying to protect Joshua from unnecessary questions and attention. However, it now became clear that something else was hidden behind these outwardly good intentions. The family gradually, step by step, closed all of Joshua's contacts with the outside world. Forged documents, the call with false information, the absence of a follow-up check. All this allowed the couple to keep what was happening in the house completely secret for months. The investigators understood clearly for the first time that Joshua's isolation was not accidental or a temporary measure. Danielle consciously resorted to document forgery, and Mark consciously and confidently confirmed false information. The family was prepared to undertake much so that no one would interfere with their carefully constructed system of secrets. But what the couple was so carefully hiding Joshua for remained unclear. Why were the kitchen scale and the notebook with calorie calculations thrown into the garbage bag? On the same day, the 18th of February 2024, investigators methodically continued examining the area around the H family house. Attention was directed to a series of garbage bags that were neatly stacked against the back garage wall. Among household waste and food remains, a strange discovery was made that drastically changed the direction of the investigation. At the very bottom of one of the bags, police discovered a Salter brand kitchen scale that had obviously been thrown away recently. The scale was electronic, quite accurate, with clearly readable graduations. During examination, investigators found that the scale seal was not damaged, which meant it was in working condition. Next to the scale, in the same garbage bag, a thin school notebook was found that was written in neat women's handwriting. Food plan. At first, the police officers thought this had been someone's old nutrition diary or shopping lists. However, it quickly became clear that the notebook was used completely differently. It contained precise calculations of calories and portions of various products. On several pages, individual products, grams and calories were listed with ideal accuracy. One of the first entries that caught the detective's attention was a strange formula. Beans 100 grams times 2 equals 600 kilocalories. This entry was accompanied by a brief note made with red pen. Does not obey. Reduce. The investigation, Salman, immediately became interested in this detail. It became obvious that the notebook could be directly connected to Joshua's condition, since his critically low weight had already been established by the doctors. Initially, the investigators allowed the possibility that the records might belong to the parents themselves. Perhaps they were keeping some kind of diet. But already the first data from the notebook made it clear that it was not about an adult. The portions were too small, obviously insufficient for an adult organism. The first question the investigators asked themselves was the reliability of the found scale. Could it be that the scale was defective and the family did not recognize the incorrectness of the calculations? To verify this fact, the scale was sent for laboratory testing. The examination results came back after a few hours. The deviation of the scale readings was less than 1%. This excluded the possibility of a technical error. This meant all calculations indicated in the notebook were consciously made by those who used them. After this, the investigation decided to check whether there were signs that the family purposefully bought products according to the found calculations. Thus, a new witness was discovered. Terry S., a salesperson from the local store, Ripley Mart. He remembered very well how Danielle H. came to the store on the 5th of February and bought 24 cans of beans at once. The purchase seemed unusual to him, and he remembered her words. That's all he deserves. This phrase now received a completely different meaning. These new details finally convinced the investigators that it was precisely about strict control of Joshua's nutrition. But it remained incomprehensible why such important and compromising evidence had been thrown into the garbage bag. Someone from the parents was obviously trying to eliminate evidence. At the beginning of the investigation, the police officers cautiously put forward the hypothesis that the found notebook might be old and have nothing to do with Joshua at all. Perhaps the H spouses themselves practiced a strict diet and had long stopped using it. However, this version quickly lost its meaning when the investigators noticed the dates of the entries on the last pages of the notebook. They were fresh, completely current. At the end of the day, the criminalists finally took fingerprints from the notebook and compared them with the database. The result was expected, but no less frightening for that. On the pages with portion calculations, the fingerprints of Danielle and Mark were clearly established. The examination confirmed that the last entries were made only 2 days before that morning when Joshua was found in the attic. Thus, the investigators received for the first time not only indirect, but direct confirmation that both parents together participated in the strict limitation of Joshua's nutrition. The food plan notebook thrown in the trash and the Salter scale became the last and most important evidence that definitively connected Danielle and Mark with the cause of the tragedy. Now the police had no doubt that these were not simply coincidences or inexplicable matches. The H spouses consciously conducted detailed control over how much food Joshua received and intentionally reduced its amount. This discovery led the investigation into a new phase. Only one thing remained to understand: why the parents so methodically controlled his nutrition and what exactly they wanted to achieve with this. After almost a year of investigations and court proceedings, the Court of Brown District began on the 30th of January 2025 with the announcement of the final verdict in the case of Mark and Danielle H. From the moment of the first statements to the prosecutor's closing speech, all evidence and all indications had been carefully examined. Now the court had no more doubts. Everything that happened to Joshua was not an accident, but conscious and joint actions of both parents. The judge slowly enumerated the evidence and connected each link of the chain that had led to the tragedy. The first was the receipt from Lowe's store and the DNA discovered on the bicycle chain lock. The investigation confirmed that exactly Mark had bought the chain already in summer 2023, and exactly he had attached it to the couch. Confirmation of this was the fresh scar on Joshua's skin, which arose precisely through multiple application of the chain in the last days of his life. The second link was connected with the falsified school documents. The investigation established that exactly Danielle personally forged the school nurse's signature on the certificate to hide the true state of affairs from social services and teachers. The recording of the phone conversation that Mark conducted on the 10th of October 2023 finally confirmed the intentional isolation of Joshua. The court emphasized that the parents acted together. Each from his side helped to create the illusion that everything was fine in their house. The third and decisive link was connected with the found kitchen scale and nutrition diary. The detailed notebook with calorie calculations and strict portion limitations became the main evidence that Joshua's emaciation was not an accident and not the result of illness. The record of the salesperson from Ripley Mart store about the purchase of 24 cans of beans and Danielle's words that "that's all he deserves" became decisive for the court. The official examination confirmed the accuracy of the scale and excluded any technical errors. Only one moment remained that required explanation. Mark's 70 minutes of free time on the evening of the 12th of February 2024. This time window completely fit into that period when, according to expert conclusion, Joshua was again chained to the bed with the chain. The court officially confirmed that Mark had done this before the start of his shift at the chemical factory, and Danielle, who remained in the house, continued her role in controlling Joshua's nutrition and condition. When the judge moved to the final part of the verdict, tension in the hall noticeably increased. Until this moment, Mark maintained absolute composure. However, at the mention of punishment, he suddenly jumped up and shouted, "The weak are prepared for life." He tried to rush forward but was immediately stopped by court security. Danielle sat motionless at this moment, only quietly lowered her head and did not try to intervene. Later in her final word, she briefly explained her actions. "I was afraid of child services." The judge made a brief pause, after which he continued reading the final verdict. It was emphasized that the actions of both parents were coordinated and completely conscious. Mark initiated the strict regime of so-called toughening, and Danielle carefully controlled and supported this regime, recording everything in the notebook and monitoring the amount of food, strictly limiting Joshua's portions. Ultimately, the court sentenced Mark H. to 30 years imprisonment with the possibility of conditional early release not earlier than after 25 years. Danielle H. received 25 years imprisonment with the possibility of reviewing her case after 20 years. The judge separately emphasized that through the investigation, any suspicions against Evan M., Joshua's older stepbrother, as well as against school nurse Kathy R., were definitively excluded, who were drawn into the events exclusively through the parents' fault. However, one line remained outside the official investigation that was never directly spoken in court proceedings. The investigation allowed the possibility that this might not have been the first case of such educational measures in the family. There were unconfirmed witness testimonies regarding Joshua's older sister. However, all attempts to prove this documentarily failed. The court did not have sufficient grounds for official consideration, and this line was left without announcement. The court proceeding ended briefly and soberly. None of those present spoke another word. After the verdict, the 8 spouses were led out of the hall through different doors, without meeting each other's eyes. The spectators began silently leaving the courtroom, understanding that Joshua's tragedy was not an accident, but a cruelly calculated plan, thought out and implemented by those who should have cared for him more than anyone else.